The ancient Egyptians, like every other culture, engaged in the practice of marriage. But there are some things about Egyptian marriage that may surprise you. Find out on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Marriage as an institution is as old as mankind itself. But like most cultures, Egypt had idiosyncrasies to the institution that made it stand out from our Western concept of marriage. And today, we're going to discuss what we know about marriage in ancient Egypt. First, let's establish some of the basics. Most of what we know about marriage in Egypt comes from the literate classes. Craftsmen, priests, nobility. On the other hand, we know practically nothing about the marriages of farmers, since Egyptian farmers left us virtually no records of their domestic life. In fact, we know more about the marriages of slaves than we do for farmers. Generally speaking, the higher the social status, the more we know about those marriages, since the primary sources talk about those situations more. Now, what we know is that marriage in Egypt was between one man and one woman. The family unit of husband, wife, and children was seen as the normative unit of Egyptian society and religion. As such, non-binary marriages were not a thing in ancient Egypt. On the other hand, interracial and interfaith marriages were common. And these differences in thought and practice were not seen as an impediment to a good marriage. Also, it should be noted that female virginity was not a prized commodity in Egyptian marriage in the same way that it was prized in Israelite marriage. And this is sort of to be expected since promiscuity was fairly common among unmarried Egyptians. 2. There are no records of Egyptian wedding ceremonies. Marriage in Egypt appears to be a civil, but not a religious ceremony. And overall, it appears to have been an agreement between two parties. Now, for couples participating in a first marriage, these were generally arranged by the families of the groom and bride. In addition, the marriages of slaves were also arranged by the slave owners as a reward for loyal service. However, second marriages and subsequent marriages were generally agreements made directly between the groom and the bride. In the Hellenistic periods, the Egyptians adopted the Greek practice of using written contracts for marriage agreements. And some of those agreements got quite spicy. Number 3. Polygamy was not permitted except for the king. The typical Egyptian could only be in one marriage at a time, and polygamy was not permitted. The only exception to this was the king, who had many political marriages. Even the crown prince was not permitted to marry multiple wives until he became king. So, in order to marry someone else, a couple would have to usually divorce first. Number 4. Marital property was divided into thirds. As a condition of marriage, the groom is expected to provide a house, which the courts regarded as 1/3 of the overall property. It is then presumed that the husband and the wife each brings their own 1/3 of the overall property. And it is true that in Egypt, women could own property and sometimes had their own large estates. Regardless of the actual property brought into the marriage by the parties, the amounts were equalized to, quote, thirds, which was really all the property except the house divided 50-50. 5. Children made a marriage permanent. The procreation of children gave a wife additional rights. If a husband died without producing children, a brother could swoop in and claim 2/3 of the inheritance, the house plus the husband's, quote, third. And the widow only got to keep the, quote, third of the property she in theory brought to the marriage. On the other hand, if the wife produces children and the husband dies, the wife inherits the husband's house and manages the husband's third until the children come of age. When the children come of age, the wife keeps the house and her third, and the husband's third is divided among the children. If the wife dies without producing children, the husband gets to keep her third. But, there's a catch. He may have to ask her spirit for permission in the afterlife how to spend it. Yes, there are records of this actually happening. For example, Ostrika Louvre N698. 6. Marriage is more permanent the higher the social status. The higher the status of the marital partner, the more stable the marriage. A royal marriage never ended in divorce. Sometimes the death penalty, but never divorce. Marriages for hereditary governors and viziers were highly political, and seldom, if ever, ended in divorce. Marriages among the craftsmen were, on the other hand, virtual revolving doors of marriage and divorce. The lower the political stakes, the more frequent was divorce and remarriage. 7. Concubines were permitted where there were no children. While polygamy was not permitted, if there were no children, a man was allowed to purchase concubines for the purpose of procreation. As an alternative to prostitution, a woman in Egypt could sell herself as a sexual slave called a concubine, and attempt the concubine's gambit. It's a calculated risk for the concubine. The way the gambit works is that a man would purchase the concubine if he had no children with his wife. If the concubine produces a child before the wife is divorced and the concubine becomes the new wife. The old wife walks away with her third, and the concubine becomes entitled to half of her husband's property. If the concubine is unable to produce children, or the wife produces a child first, the concubine loses the gambit and is sold off. A famous example of a concubine using the concubine's gambit is Hagar. Hagar sold herself as a concubine in Egypt under the presumption that she'd be entering into the concubine's gambit. However, Hagar lost the gambit because Abraham and Sarah played by their own private interpretation of Mesopotamian law codes, not according to Egyptian custom. 8. Divorce was easy and rarely involved the law courts. Both the husband and the wife had the right to initiate a divorce. All a partner had to do to divorce a spouse was to say, "I divorce you," 3 times. And if there is a divorce but no children, the husband keeps the house and his third, and the wife keeps her third. If there were children, the husband loses the house to the wife, but walks away with his third of the property. Generally, the courts were not involved in divorces, unless the division of property couldn't be easily resolved. Courts were used when a division among thirds was not practical. For example, you could not divide a single slave into thirds. And food rations were divided along 1 to 2.75 proportions, instead of the 2/3, 1/3, since a 1/3 portion of food was not sufficient to feed anyone. So there you have it. Egyptian marriage in a nutshell. We hope you enjoyed this video and learned something and found it interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.